Laura Bennett stepped out of the notary's office in downtown Columbus, Ohio, and paused for a moment on the sidewalk. October was usually gray and unforgiving, but that morning the sky was unexpectedly clear, the sunlight sharp enough to make her squint. Cars moved past in steady lines. People hurried along with coffee cups and phones pressed to their ears. Nothing about the street suggested that anything extraordinary had just happened. Inside her handbag lay a thin folder of documents, light in weight, yet impossibly heavy in meaning. They confirmed what the notary had explained only minutes earlier: an inheritance left to her by a distant French relative she had never met, a woman named Helene Dubois, an estate outside Paris, financial assets large enough to alter the course of a life. The words still felt unreal, like something she had overheard rather than something addressed directly to her. Laura did not feel joy. She felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. Her head throbbed faintly, and a dull exhaustion settled into her shoulders. All she wanted was to go home, to take off her coat, to let the quiet of familiar rooms convince her that the world was still the same. The drive back took her through streets she had known for years. Modest houses, gas stations, a grocery store advertising weekly specials on its marquee sign. Everything looked exactly as it always had. That, more than anything else, made the moment feel strange. Her life, at least on the surface, remained unchanged, even though something irreversible had already begun. As she waited at a red light, her thoughts drifted backward. She remembered her grandmother's small house, the creak of old floorboards, the steady hands that had raised her after her parents disappeared from her life. Her mother had left early, chasing promises that never came back. Her father had faded more slowly, until he was little more than a name attached to a disappointment. Laura had grown up believing she came from nowhere special, that her place in the world was something to be earned quietly and never demanded. The inheritance did not feel like a reward. It felt like a disruption, a question mark placed at the center of everything she thought she understood. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel and turned onto her street, unaware that the documents in her bag were not only about property or money, but about a truth that would soon collide with the life she was returning to. Laura parked in her usual spot behind the apartment building and sat for a moment before getting out. The late morning light had shifted, softer now, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. She checked the time out of habit. Mark would normally still be at work. Susan, too, should have been out, running errands or visiting one of her friends. The apartment should have been empty. She unlocked the door quietly and stepped inside, closing it with the same careful motion she had practiced for years. Living with Susan Bennett had taught her things she had never consciously chosen to learn: how to place her keys without a sound, how to walk without letting her heels strike the floor, how to exist without announcing herself. It was easier that way. Silence drew less attention. The apartment looked exactly as it always did. The sofa cushions were arranged with rigid precision. Family photos lined the shelf above the television, mostly Susan and Mark, taken at different stages of his life. Laura appeared in only a few of them, always at the edge, always slightly out of frame. The space was familiar, but it never felt like it truly belonged to her. Comfort here was conditional. She slipped off her coat and was about to move toward the bedroom when she heard voices. They drifted from the kitchen, low but unmistakable. Susan's voice cut through the air first, sharp and tightly controlled, carrying that familiar edge of irritation. Mark's voice followed, quieter, hesitant. Laura froze in the hallway. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. Her shoulders tensed. Her breath grew shallow. Something about the tone of Susan's voice warned her to stay where she was. Laura leaned slightly against the wall, her fingers curling around the strap of her handbag. She had not intended to listen. In fact, she would have preferred not to. But the words continued, and once she recognized the rhythm of the exchange, she understood that this was not a casual conversation. Susan sounded agitated, her sentences clipped and emphatic. Mark responded with pauses, as if choosing his words carefully, or perhaps avoiding choosing them at all. The apartment seemed to hold its breath with her. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the clock above the doorway, the distant noise of traffic outside, all of it faded into the background. Laura remained motionless in the hallway, suspended between the life she thought she was returning to and whatever waited for her in the kitchen, unaware that this moment of stillness was the last before everything changed. Susan's voice rose first, cutting cleanly through the thin wall that separated the kitchen from the hallway. "I've had enough, Mark. I truly have," she said, her words sharp with irritation. "I don't know how much longer you expect me to tolerate this." Laura felt her chest tighten. She stayed where she was, her back pressed lightly against the wall, every muscle locked in place. "Tolerate what?" Mark asked. His voice was low, cautious, already defensive. "Mom, you're exaggerating." "Exaggerating?" Susan scoffed. "I'm talking about your wife, about the constant embarrassment." Her background alone should have been a warning. Raised by a grandmother in some forgotten town. No family to speak of, no standards. And now she thinks she belongs here. Laura's face flushed, heat rushing to her cheeks. She stared at the floor, as if it might anchor her to something solid. Susan continued without pause. "And her job, please. Working in that little travel office, as if it's a real career. Do you know how that looks to people? To our family? She doesn't even understand how to behave. The way she speaks, the way she dresses. Did you see what she wore to Catherine's birthday dinner? Completely inappropriate. No sense of decorum." "Mom, that's not fair," Mark said, but the protest sounded tired, almost rehearsed. "She tries. She's not a bad person." "Oh, I'm sure she tries," Susan replied coldly. "But trying isn't the same as belonging. A respectable family has certain expectations. Your father would never have allowed this." Laura's fingers trembled slightly. She pressed them into the fabric of her bag to steady herself. "Mom, let's not do this again," Mark said. "We've talked about it." "No, you've avoided it," Susan snapped. "I'm tired of pretending this situation is acceptable. I'm tired of living under the same roof as someone who doesn't know her place." There was a brief silence. Laura held her breath. Susan's voice returned, quieter now, but harder. "So I'll make it simple for you, Mark. Either she goes or I do. I will not live like this anymore. Choose." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Mark did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked conviction. "Mom, let me think. You know how difficult things are." That hesitation said more than any declaration could have. Laura felt the pain then, sharp, precise, leaving no room for doubt. It cut through years of excuses, of patience, of believing that if she endured long enough, things might change. Standing there, unseen and unacknowledged, she understood what she had refused to see before. She did not wait to hear more, moving with the same quiet care that had become second nature. Laura turned back toward the door. She slipped her coat from the hook, eased the handle open, and stepped out into the hallway without a sound. By the time the door closed behind her, her decision was already taking shape, not in words, but in the calm certainty that she would never walk back into that apartment the same way again. Outside, the air felt colder than it had when Laura arrived. She stood on the narrow sidewalk in front of the building, her breath visible now, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her coat. For a moment, she simply stared at the entrance she had just left, half expecting the door to open behind her. It didn't. As she began to walk, her thoughts unraveled all at once, looping back on themselves in a single, relentless phrase. If they only knew. The words repeated with every step. if they knew what was sitting in her handbag, if they knew about the letter that had arrived a month ago, written in careful, formal language. France, a distant relative named Helene Dubois, an estate outside Paris, old and fully paid for, financial accounts that carried more zeros than Laura had ever imagined seeing next to her name. The irony pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. Susan's contempt, Mark's silence, the constant implication that Laura was lucky to be tolerated at all. How quickly would that change if they knew? How differently would Susan's voice sound if wealth and lineage suddenly stood behind the woman she dismissed so easily? The realization came with unsettling clarity. She did not feel satisfaction at the thought. She felt something colder. Laura stopped at the corner and leaned against a street lamp, closing her eyes. The inheritance had arrived without warning, without effort on her part. She had done nothing to earn it, just as she had done nothing to deserve the years of quiet humiliation she had endured. And suddenly she understood what the letter truly represented. It was a test, not one she had chosen, not one she had planned, but one that now existed all the same. She could reveal the truth, watch attitudes shift, watch respect bloom overnight. Or she could remain silent and see what remained when money and status were stripped away. The answer, she realized, was already painfully clear. Laura reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her hands were steadier than she expected as she scrolled to a number she had known by heart since childhood. She hesitated only a second before pressing call. "Ethan," she said when he answered, her voice quieter than usual. "Can I come over?" "Right now." There was no pause on the other end of the line. No question she had to justify. "Of course," Ethan replied immediately. "I'm home. Come whenever you're ready." Laura let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, as she turned toward the street to flag down a cab. She knew one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, she would face it without explaining herself to anyone who had never truly wanted to understand her in the first place. Ethan's apartment greeted Laura with a warmth she felt the moment she stepped inside. The lights were soft, the air scented faintly with coffee, and the familiar creak of the floorboards grounded her in memories that reached back to childhood. This was a place where she had never needed to explain herself, where she had always been welcome simply because she was Laura. Ethan took her coat without comment and gestured toward the living room. "Sit," he said gently. "I'll make some coffee." She settled onto the couch, her shoulders slowly loosening as the quiet wrapped around her. When Ethan returned and set a mug in her hands, the warmth seeped into her fingers, steadying her more than any words could have. For a moment, they sat in silence. Then Laura began to speak. She told him about the notary's office, about the letter from France, about the estate outside Paris, and inheritance that still felt unreal. Ethan listened, his expression attentive but calm, as if absorbing the weight of the news without letting it overwhelm the space between them. When she finished, he nodded once, signaling that she could continue if she wished. So she did. She told him about coming home early, about the voices from the kitchen, about Susan's words and Mark's hesitation. As she spoke, Laura was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The pain was still there, sharp beneath the surface, but it no longer threatened to break her open. "I think I've been trying to earn a place that was never meant for me," she said quietly. "No matter what I did, it was never enough." Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice or rush to reassure her. He simply listened, and in that listening, Laura felt something shift. She realized how long she had lived in a state of silent negotiation, constantly adjusting herself, hoping that if she became smaller or better or quieter, she would finally be accepted. Her phone buzzed on the table. Mark's name flashed across the screen. Laura glanced at it, then turned the phone face down. A few minutes later, it rang again. This time it was Susan. Laura didn't move. For the first time, she did not feel the familiar pull to explain, to apologize, to smooth things over. The room was warm. The coffee was still hot. Ethan was there, present and unhurried. That was enough. She leaned back against the couch and closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest instead of react. The decision was subtle, almost quiet, but it was decisive all the same. Laura was no longer pleading inwardly to be chosen. She was finally allowing herself to exist without asking permission. Laura spent the night in Ethan's guest room, a space prepared without ceremony, as if her presence there required no explanation. The bed was neatly made, the lamp beside it already switched on. When the door closed behind her, the quiet felt different from the silence she had known for years. It was not tense or watchful. It simply existed. Sleep came in fragments, in the hours between waking and drifting off again. Laura's thoughts returned to the past with an honesty she had long avoided. She replayed moments she had once dismissed as misunderstandings or bad days, comments brushed aside, apologies she made even when she was not at fault, compromises she convinced herself were necessary. She saw how often she had adjusted herself to fit into a space that had never truly opened for her. Lying in the dark, she acknowledged a thought that felt both painful and strangely relieving. She was no longer certain that Mark had ever loved her in the way she had needed. What he seemed to love, she realized, was ease, stability, a wife who did not challenge his routines or demand that he choose sides, someone who absorbed discomfort quietly so he wouldn't have to confront it. Saying it aloud the next morning made it real. They sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight filtering through the blinds. Laura spoke calmly without accusation, as if naming a truth she had finally accepted rather than discovering something new. Ethan listened, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think he ever chose me," she said. "Not really." Ethan didn't argue with her. He didn't try to soften the realization. He simply nodded. After a moment, he spoke. "If you want, I can go back with you. To get your things." The offer was simple, practical, and carefully worded. There was no pressure in it. Laura hesitated. The image of the apartment returned to her. The narrow hallway, Susan's voice, Mark's avoidance. A familiar tightening formed in her chest, then slowly loosened. "Yes," she said finally. "That would help." The decision settled into place without drama or raised voices. There was no surge of anger, no need for confrontation. What guided her now was clarity. She finished her coffee, stood, and gathered herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was no longer asking for permission. When they left the apartment together a short while later, Laura felt steady. Not triumphant, not broken, just certain that the path ahead, whatever it held, would no longer require her to disappear in order to remain. They arrived early, just after 7. The hallway outside the Bennett apartment was quiet, the kind of stillness that usually meant Susan was still asleep and Mark already gone to work. Laura unlocked the door with the same key she had used for years, expecting the familiar emptiness. Instead, Susan stood in the hallway in a silk robe, her hair carefully brushed, her posture rigid with alertness. She looked startled for a split second, then her expression hardened when she noticed Ethan standing just behind Laura. "Well," Susan said sharply, "so you decided to come back." Before Laura could respond, Mark appeared from the kitchen. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept, his movements abrupt and uncertain. "Laura," he said, relief and irritation tangled together. "Where did you go last night? Mom was worried." Laura closed the door behind her and met his gaze steadily. "I heard everything," she said. Her voice was calm, even, stripped of emotion. "Your conversation yesterday with your mother." The words landed heavily. Mark's face tightened. He glanced at Susan, then back at Laura. "You misunderstood," he said quickly. "She was upset. She worries too much. You know how she gets." Susan scoffed. "Misunderstood? I was being honest." Laura didn't look at her. She kept her focus on Mark. "Honesty isn't the problem," she said. Silence is. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. Laura, you know I care about you, he said. Things are complicated. Mom just wants what's best for us. Laura shook her head slowly. Love isn't complicated, she replied. It's not about avoiding conflict or keeping the peace at someone else's expense. Love means protecting your partner, standing beside them. And you never did that. Susan's outrage flared. How dare you speak to him like that, she snapped. After everything we've done for you. Sneaking off. Bringing another man into my house. Do you have any shame at all? Ethan remained silent, his presence steady but unobtrusive. This isn't your house, Laura said quietly. And he isn't another man. He's my friend. The only one here who never asked me to become smaller to belong. Susan's face reddened. Unbelievable, she muttered. This is betrayal. Without responding, Laura turned toward the bedroom. She opened the closet and began pulling clothes from the hangers, folding them carefully. Ethan stepped forward to help, gathering books and personal items into boxes he had brought. Mark hovered in the doorway, uncertain, as if waiting for permission to intervene. Laura, we can talk about this, he said again. We don't have to do this right now. She looked up at him briefly. We already did, she said. Yesterday. As she continued packing, something subtle shifted in the room. Susan's authority faltered. Mark's excuses rang hollow. And Laura, for the first time in that apartment, moved freely, no longer careful about the space she occupied. Susan was the one who found the letter. She had stormed into the bedroom in the middle of Laura's packing, muttering under her breath about disrespect and ingratitude. As Laura folded the last stack of clothes into a suitcase, Susan yanked open the top drawer of the dresser with unnecessary force. Papers slid forward. An envelope slipped out and fell to the floor. Susan froze. She bent down, picked it up, and frowned at the letterhead. Her eyes moved quickly as she read the first lines. The color drained from her face. What is this? She demanded, holding the envelope up as if it were evidence. France? An estate? Inheritance? Laura straightened slowly. For a moment, no one spoke. Susan's shock transformed almost instantly into something else. Her posture softened. Her voice, moments ago, sharp with accusation, shifted into something almost polite. You never mentioned this, she said carefully. This is significant. Mark stepped forward and took the letter from his mother's hands. He read it in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. When he looked up at Laura, his expression had changed completely. Laura, he said, his voice unsteady. Why didn't you tell me? This changes things. She met his gaze without flinching. We can fix this, Mark continued quickly, the words tumbling out now. We can start over. Mom didn't know. I didn't know. If we'd understood, Laura raised her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. No, she said quietly. The room went still. I didn't tell you because I needed to know something first, Laura continued. I needed to know whether I mattered without this. She gestured briefly toward the letter. Without money, without property, without anything that would make me acceptable in your eyes. Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. That's not fair, she said. You can't expect people not to care about. I didn't expect anything, Laura replied. I observed. She turned back to Mark. And now I have my answer. Mark swallowed. Laura, please. We can make this work. You don't have to leave. I already did, she said. Ethan closed the final box and lifted it without a word. Laura zipped her suitcase and picked it up, her movements unhurried. Susan opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Laura paused once at the doorway and looked back. I'm grateful, she said evenly. Not for the inheritance. For the clarity. Then she walked out. Ethan followed, carrying the boxes down the hallway. Laura did not look back as the door closed behind them. Whatever arguments or regrets waited inside that apartment no longer belonged to her. and she refused to carry them any further. 3 months later, Laura's life bore little resemblance to the one she had stepped out of that October morning. The divorce moved forward quietly and without resistance. Mark did not contest it. There were no drawn-out arguments, no bitter negotiations. Laura waived any claim to shared assets without hesitation, signing the papers with a steady hand. When the attorney asked if she was certain, she nodded once. She did not want anything that tied her to a life she had already left behind. Shortly after, she relocated temporarily to France. The estate outside Paris stood exactly as described in the letter. Aged but dignified, its stone walls weathered by time rather than neglect. Laura spent her days walking through echoing rooms, meeting with architects and preservation specialists, learning what it would take to restore the property without erasing its history. The work was demanding in ways she hadn't anticipated. It required decisions, confidence, and the ability to say no. Each challenge grounded her further in the present. For the first time in years, Laura's focus belonged entirely to her own future. She traveled often, splitting her time between meetings, site visits, and long evenings spent reviewing plans at a broad wooden desk that overlooked the garden. The rhythm of work left little space for regret. The past receded not because it had been forgiven, but because it no longer held authority over her. Ethan visited whenever his schedule allowed, sometimes for a long weekend, sometimes just a few days. They talked over simple meals, walked the grounds together, discussed renovations and practical details. Their closeness deepened naturally, without urgency or expectation. Laura did not feel the need to define it. What mattered was how she felt in her own skin. She noticed the change in small ways. She slept through the night. She made decisions without rehearsing explanations. When challenges arose, she addressed them directly, without shrinking or second-guessing herself. The woman who once measured her worth by how little trouble she caused was gone. Laura understood now that healing was not about forgetting what had happened. It was about reclaiming authorship over her own life. Standing at the edge of the property one evening, watching the last light settle over the trees, she felt something she hadn't expected so soon: peace. Not the fragile kind that depended on approval or stability, but a solid, earned calm. Her life was no longer shaped by endurance. It was shaped by choice. By spring, the estate had changed. Apple trees along the gravel paths bloomed in soft white clusters, and the air carried the scent of lilac and damp earth. Laura often stood at the tall windows of her temporary office, watching the garden come back to life, feeling as if the season were unfolding alongside her. What had once felt heavy and unfamiliar now felt rooted, real. One evening, as dusk settled over the grounds, Laura and Ethan sat together beneath a vine-covered pergola. The workday had ended quietly. There were no plans to discuss, no decisions left to make. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago," he said, his voice steady but careful. He looked at her, not searching her face, but meeting it honestly. "I loved you when we were younger. I never said anything because you chose another life. I didn't want to interfere with that." Laura didn't interrupt. She listened, the truth of his words settling without shock. "I waited," he continued, "not because I expected anything. I just wanted you to be happy." He reached into his pocket and took out a small, simple box. There was no drama in the gesture, no rehearsed speech. "I don't want to wait any more," he said. "If you'll have me." Laura felt the answer rise before he finished the sentence. She nodded once, her voice quiet but certain. "Yes." They married at the estate weeks later, surrounded by blooming trees and a handful of people who knew them well. There was no grandeur, no performance, just vows spoken clearly without fear or doubt. Laura's grandmother stood beside her, tears in her eyes, whispering words she had spoken years before about love and worth. Not long after, Laura learned she was pregnant. She stood alone in the same office one morning, a hand resting lightly against her stomach. The future suddenly layered with new meaning. The news didn't overwhelm her. It grounded her. Mark had moved on, she heard later. Susan remained exactly as she always had. But neither occupied Laura's thoughts. Their lives continued somewhere else, untouched by her choices, just as hers no longer bent around theirs. Looking out over the estate, Laura reflected on the path that had led her here. She understood now that losing everything she once clung to had not been a failure. It had been the beginning. Some lives, she realized, are not built through endurance. They are built through the courage to leave, to choose dignity over acceptance, and to wait for a love that never asks you to disappear in order to belong.